Hello and welcome to All the Things. I am Monique Duson.
And I am Krista Bontrager, and this is the show
where we talk about all things related to God, the Bible, and real life, even when we're not together. Yes.
That's right. This is sort of an emergency episode of all the things.
Yes, it really is. And I'm at my brother's house, even though it looks like I've been taken hostage.
Blink twice for yes, and we will rescue you.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I am dog sitting while my brother and his family are on vacation. And so this is where I'm at.
This is where you are. Yeah.
This is where I am.
So now we were supposed to be live, but we had a little hiccup with the scheduling. So we are actually pre-recording this on Friday afternoon. And it has been quite a week. I have lost a couple of days working on my dissertation because I've been horsing around on Twitter, on X, following all the drama of what's happening with Megan Basham since her book dropped to my Kindle on Tuesday. And boy, I've been sending you a lot of tweets because the mob has been coming for her.
You have been sending me a lot of tweets, and I am like, you know what? I'm not even going to share what, it's too early in the show to share what my thoughts are. But I will say this, we are live in the comments. So go ahead, make sure that you are commenting. We will respond. Make sure to share the show out. Share it with an enemy because, you know, that's
always fun.
Yeah, I'm here for the smoke, so do it. Yes, we also want to thank our moderators tonight for joining us and making sure that our comments stay appropriate. Trust me, if you decide to come, you can come crazy. We will respond with you. Just, you know, keep it politely crazy because we love Jesus.
That's right. Now, we had this interview set up with Megan for a couple of months, and we've been looking forward to it. And so then things got nuts this week on social media. And so it just so happens that we are recording this now in a few days after her book is dropped. Now, I've read the whole book, and the only thing I'm going to say right now is do not go by the reviews. Don't go by the Twitter posts. Don't go by, you know, concern trolls that are going to come on the stream that have concerns about things. Read the book. And so it's called Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. Go read the book, make up your own mind, read the footnotes. I've been going through the footnotes myself, looking up a lot of things, verifying, and I'll share more about that later as we get into it. But I want to encourage everyone, make up your own mind. You're an intelligent person. You're an expert in something, I promise you, whether you're a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, a crocheter, a knitter, whatever you are an expert on something. If we were to sit down and coffee, you would tell me all about something you are an expert on. I know it. You're an intelligent person. Go read the book and make up your own mind. Because
girl, I've been going through this book. I'm about halfway through, and I'm just sitting there like with my popcorn. Sipping my tea. I'm like, I can't believe she said that. Did she say that for real? Oh, she did. Let me read that sentence again.
Well, now here's the thing, is that in most of the chapters, not all, but most of the chapters, many of the chapters are things that you and I have been talking about since 2020. We have done content on. We've showed some of the videos that she references. We've showed some of the blog posts and the tweets. So if people follow our content pretty closely, there's very little in this book that is going to surprise you. Most of it is just stuff that I feel like Megan has kind of come along and collected all of these breadcrumbs and put them in one place to get it out for the regular people who aren't on X and don't see these conversations. And I kind of feel like that's one of the key benefits of the book, is she's pulling together a lot of things. But you and I, we've been talking about a lot of these issues for quite a while now.
I appreciate that she's like, here's my catalog. Here you go. Yes. Okay. Well, enough talking about all of that. Let's actually talk to her and bring her on. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Just from the setup, I can tell like, okay, this is going to be a fun interview. I can relax. We can have a good time and chit chat as opposed to the very formal interviews I've been doing all week. So this is a fun way to end the week.
Oh, good.
No, girl. No, honey. We are just family here. We are the regular people. I represent the normal folk. Now Krista, she's the professional. I got a whole choir of normal people. Okay. So that is how our show flows.
So
I love it.
I've been following Megan's work for a while. I kept bringing her up to Monique, saying, like, you got to follow her. And her work is just consistently interesting. And she's highlighting a lot of things that we're highlighting. So for those of the three people that might be new to your work, Megan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in journalism and kind of what your regular beat is?
Yeah. So I've been working in journalism for well over 15 years, or probably coming up on 20, actually. My husband is in broadcast journalism, and print journalism was just a really good fit for a mom married to a broadcaster who had to move a lot. So when I came out of college, I started freelancing, writing for outlets like National Review, Wall Street Journal, American Spectator, a lot of political outlets, but also a lot of Christian outlets. Because obviously, as a Christian, that's my primary area of interest in writing. So that was always a big feature of the things I worked on, often the intersection of faith and politics. And then, as I started freelancing for World, we just kind of got a regular relationship going on. And then I had a contract with them, and then I became a full-time employee there. And so worked for World for, I think probably my first story for them was in 2008. So whether in a freelance capacity or as a contractor, or then eventually as an employee, as film and entertainment editor and co-host of their flagship news podcast, The World and Everything in It, worked there till 2021. And then experienced some of those fault lines a little bit within the company. And it's a great company, by the way. I love World. I always want to say that one. But like a lot of places, it just experienced that upheaval of 2020 that Bodhi Bacham wrote about, that you guys talk about. And I ended up going over to the Daily Wire. And I think part of it, and it was in 2021, and I think part of being at the Daily Wire was, for the first time in my life, I was working exclusively at a secular, though conservative, secular media outlet. And it was almost like I was standing outside the house for the first time, and I could talk about things with a freedom that I maybe didn't have before, because suddenly I was working with a lot of people who didn't know about these evangelical things. And I was explaining to them, hey, listen, this is a really important area that we should be writing about too, because The Atlantic writes about it, the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, all of these secular outlets are covering this beat, and they're covering it from a very progressive lens. And so that's how I started writing about these topics, while covering a lot of other culture topics for the Daily Wire.
I think you just mentioned a whole plethora of different news outlets. You have CNN and the Daily Wire, and then you have World, and then you have, all of these different outlets. And I think the one thing that, definitely connects them all is someone like you is a reporter who actually compiles and reports the news. But I also think that, what you're hitting on as far as, I'm a Christian and I'm a reporter, help us understand, or help me understand, because maybe they get it already, what would be the traditional role of just a good reporter? And then what are some of the distinguishing principles or values between like what we see as a good reporter and maybe someone who is a reporter, but maybe they work for a news outlet that's not necessarily so reputable, or maybe they don't hold the same ethical values?
And that's what's interesting as a Christian reporter, because what you tend to see in secular media is this idea of you're just balancing views, and then that presents truth. Like if you're going to take something like the issue of abortion, they might say, I'm going to get a quote from a pro-lifer, I'm going to get a quote from a Planned Parenthood staffer, and I'm going to put both of them in this story, and that is going to have somehow create a balance. So there's an ideology with a secular reporter that truth is not fixed and it can't be known. So all you can do is present views. And I don't think that's what I do. I do believe in a fixed truth. So when I'm reporting on something, whether it's sexuality, marriage, life, I'm lining it up against that plumb line of that ruler and going, how does it interact with what I know is fixed, unchanging truth? And I do think that that is a little bit different on how a Christian reporter is going to approach their job versus somebody of some other faith or no faith. So that's one. And in terms of practices, if we're talking about how am I pursuing a story, part of what I'm doing on that is I am reflecting what I believe is transcendent morality. So if someone is telling me something that they believe to be true, but I know from a biblical standpoint, it doesn't align with the word of God, I'm not going to present it as true. I may quote them and I may say, here's what they say, here's their perspective, but I'm not going to present it as this is like a man can become a woman. I'm not going to present that as a legitimate point of view.
I'm thinking that for like my daughter, she's 25 and she's kind of dipped her toe into the realm of journalism and had a few articles published in the Christian Post and that sort of thing. And for Tucker Carlson's, I can't remember, the Daily Caller or something.
Yeah.
So I guess from a Christian standpoint, I guess I'm thinking that it would be challenging as a serious Christian who's informed about your worldview to participate in journalism to some degree, because is there an expectation that you're going to report things in a way that will sometimes go against your worldview? Is that been a struggle for you at all?
It hasn't so much because of the career path I've taken. Now, if I were to go work for a media outlet that is a legacy secular, like a New York Times, and if I had the AP, which it does, dictating to me particular terms, like they have done things like say, well, you're not going to use pro-life anymore. Instead, I can't remember what they switched the terminology, but they are now making value judgments in terminology. Say something like the pronoun question. So they might dictate you will use a transgender person's pronouns. And personally, that would be a conscience issue for me. I couldn't do that. So I'm not quite sure how I would be able to do my job for an outlet like that. It's not an issue with the Daily Wire. It wasn't an issue with World. But I can absolutely envision that there would be some real conflict there that you would run up against.
So what would you say is the state of Christian journalism right now? Do you feel like it's robust and healthy? Do you think that maybe there's areas for improvement that need to happen? Has it changed in the last 10 years? How would you characterize the current state of Christian journalism?
I would say it is anemic. There are great people doing great work, but there's just such a need. When I started writing about this stuff in a really specific way, once I got outside of World and I started looking at how these large evangelical institutions are wielding their influence, I was so inundated with people who had stories they wanted me to tell. And there were good stories and relevant stories, but there was just not the time to cover them all. And it was a very, very much the feeling of the harvest has, the fields are very, very ripe and there's very few workers to go in and tell all these stories and do all this reporting. So one, I would say, we need more Christian journalists for sure, especially because you are seeing so much more secular media interest, I think, in evangelicals, and they're very much trying to craft narratives to move the church, and there's not a whole lot of pushback. And so, and I think they're telling a lot of false stories and stories that don't get questioned. And, I talk about this a little bit in my book. I felt like on a number of faith-related stories, entirely or in part, false narratives were promoted, and you didn't see as much questioning even from Christian media as I would have preferred. That I thought us with, this foundation of biblical truth, it feels like there should have been more cross-examination of what was just sort of the easy answers to things. And that didn't happen. And I thought it should, particularly on issues like Me Too. When I saw a lot of the way that the stories related to that were handled, it felt like we just did the same thing that the secular media did. And that was disappointing. I wished that we could have challenged more of the cultural assumptions that I think were not biblical assumptions.
Well, girl, you said challenge, you said narratives, you said a lot. And I think that that's just the perfect way to start talking about Shepherds for Sale. Because what you do in this book is, at least in my opinion, I think Krista would say the same, is that you tend to tackle some of the issues that Christian journalists aren't talking about, that I feel like pastors aren't talking about in the pews, or even just among, their peer groups. Some of them, not all of them, some of them seem to be like, well, we're just not gonna venture into that topic. Help viewers who haven't read the book yet understand your position. Like, what's the core position or core thesis of your book?
So the thesis is that, maybe instead what I'll tell you is a little bit how I came to write the book. Because like a lot of people, 2018, 2019, I started to see some influences that felt like they were distinctly political, distinctly progressive, being promoted by voices that I in the past trusted, or institutions that I trusted. And it felt like a shock to hear some of these things from these organizations and well-known leaders. And then as we moved from, around 2018, 2019, right around when what seemed like a positive racial reconciliation conversation started to tip over into divisive things that, like so many people, I didn't quite know how to respond to it at first. I didn't know what acronyms like DEI or CRT meant. I wasn't nearly as plugged in as you guys were on that topic. And so it just kind of hit me where I lived, and I went, whoa, I don't know what this is. And as I started to see some of what felt like very destructive results of that, then 2020 hit, and we had COVID and the way the church handled that. And that became like clanging alarm bells for me, that we have some real problems in the church. And most of them stem from taking the same positions as our dominant cultural power centers. And so as I started writing about those topics in individual reports and getting such a response, I started meeting and talking to more people. And some of the people that I started meeting and talking to told me, hey, listen, some of this is coming from left-wing funding. There are very large foundations that are backed by a lot of well-known billionaires. Some of them like George Soros. Some of them you don't, like the eBay founder, Pierre Omidyar, who is a Buddhist. And these people who are extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, and not Christians are funneling money into institutions with the name evangelical in order to move evangelicals on policy. So that was one kind of shepherd for sale, a more literal kind. And then also in the book, I explore a more metaphorical kind where, someone's not saying, hey, cut me a check to set up this evangelical front group, but it's more, I, as a well-known influential pastor, am now receiving this media adulation when I start to parrot the talking points of CRT or climate change or whatever the issue might be. And so I start to do that more and more. And you just see a shift in that person's leadership because over time they're receiving all of those plaudits from the media and they're responding to it, or they're being given recognition and rewards at think tanks or fellowships. And that can also be a sort of influence that you could say is metaphorically for sale. So those are kind of all the things I started talking about in the book.
I think one of the things that I really appreciated about your book, though, Megan, is how you take these ideas that are out there in the academic world, like critical race theory, in the workplace, like diversity, equity, inclusion, questions about the LGBT community, but you start each chapter with a very personal story of somebody that you've talked to where these ideas have consequences. These ideas impact real people's lives. And this is one of the reasons why Monique and I are so vocal about it. It is that when we have spoken out about these issues, we're doing it because we receive so many letters from people whose families have been broken by this. Their kids have been hijacked by some of these ideologies. They have been canceled by their children. And we are sitting over here saying we want to not only sound the alarm about the real impact. Like, this isn't just I don't like it when people say, well, this is just a political conversation. Well, it might involve politics, but these ideas have real and often damaging consequences on people's lives. And I think that that's important for people to understand. We're not just trying to stir up trouble and division. I think the other thing that really came through to me in your book, and I know this is my heart too, is when I'm sounding the alarm about these trusted institutions, this is in a way my love letter to those trusted institutions. It is a plea to please turn back. Please come back to biblical faithfulness. Please say no, in some cases, to the money. Please be willing to part ways with some of your staff. Please be willing to have some courage. I kind of felt like that was part of your heart behind the book. You're not just trying to stir up trouble and division.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you led with that, because that's very true. And it is why I told these personal stories, so that you could see the impact on real people in the pews and what this was doing to their church from a very street level perspective, that this isn't just a clash of ideologies. It really is affecting people's lives. And it's also part of why I told my own story in a way that I never have before at the close of the book, because I did want to make it clear that I think there is a lot of reporting on the church that is meant to disparage and destroy the church and so many institutions therein. And that was not my interest at all. What I have absolutely wanted to do is say reform, which is why from the very first introduction, I start by saying, I am not calling for a leaderless church. We need good, godly, biblical leaders. And I am also not calling on you to leave your churches and your Christian institutions. We need good, godly Christian institutions. In fact, so I say, find yourself a godly church, be in it, because that's the best thing you can do to strengthen the church. And then finishing with, here's what I think the cost is, as somebody so very grateful that I came to salvation and that I had sound institutions that I could grow in and that I could become sanctified in. And I just wanted to present, here's what the cost is to somebody like the sinner I was if we lose those sound institutions. It's sinner I am, by the way. I was just a much worse sinner before.
Weren't we all?
Oh, I hear you. Right? Call myself a work in progress.
Right.
Yes. Krista's talked and you alluded to some of this in looking at like the founder of eBay or, things like that. Krista's done way more than I have in trying to bring awareness to the issue that, we do have people who are compromised within, our churches or within evangelicalism and things like that. But I think that, the way that you compile it in the book, at least up to the point where I have read, which is halfway through, you definitely are researching it from this issue of the money and following the money. I think what you're saying is that, hey, look, a lot of this money is tied to very progressive ideas, and this is driving a progressive agenda in the church. Can you help, for those who haven't read it, can you help us think through maybe just one clear example that you would give in the book and say, hey, look, I know you might not believe, all of this, but this one here, let me just help you think through this, because people aren't talking about it.
Yes. So I can give you a couple of really clear examples, and those are on issues that we might say are biblically debatable issues, but are being brought in through a legalism that says Christians need to find consensus in supporting these issues because of things like love your neighbor or welcome the stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spend a lot of time in those first couple of chapters on the climate change issue and on immigration, because both of those are issues on which Christians can, in good faith, take different positions. We may read through the scriptures and say, complex issue, here's what I think our policy should be. Or, as a citizen of a representative republic, this is what I think would be most beneficial to my fellow citizens while also being charitable and kind to those who want to enter our country. But though that is not how it's being debated within the church because of these left-wing foundations. So if you look at something like climate change, really starting in the early 2000s, you had very large secular foundations like the Clinton Foundation, like the Rockefeller Foundation, like a Hewlett Foundation. And by the way, all of these foundations that are very pro-abortion, in part because of their desire to control population, which also dovetails with this climate change issue. So they started funding what you have to call evangelical front groups to create AstroTurf campaigns, the false impression that there was an evangelical groundswell on these issues, and their specific purpose was to move policy. So I know that once you're in the church, it takes a different form of the debate, but if you look at these secular foundations, the way they talk about it, in their reports, they will say, well, we are having trouble getting certain legislation passed, and it's really an issue of these religious Americans, particularly evangelicals, who are not buying in. In order to get around that, we need to find a way to harness the power of evangelical leaders in the hopes that their influence will, one, trickle down to the people in the pews, and then two, convince conservative lawmakers that their most important constituency, the evangelical voter, wants them to back this piece of legislation. So that's their interest. So they funnel money into these quote unquote ministries. These ministries then begin to do things like collect letters from well-known pastors and ministry leaders on something that might be a general statement of principles. And once they sign that general statement of principles, the key people in these front groups, these shell evangelical organizations, whether it's for climate change or immigration, then will do something like draft a letter and send it to lawmakers saying, look at all these influential evangelical leaders who want you to pass this piece of legislation, whether it's cap and trade carbon emission limits or something like the Lankford border bill that would have let up to 5,000 illegal immigrants continue to enter the country. So their interest is policy. And that's what the interest of these evangelical front groups is to move policy, not to say minister to illegal immigrants by spreading the gospel or feeding and clothing them. That's not what they do.
I think you're raising a lot of important points, and I want to continue to unpack this particular issue because it really goes to the core strategy of your book. We're going to take a quick time out and hear from our friends at Birmingham Theological Seminary, the seminary where both Monique and I attend. And then we're going to hear a little bit about our book, Walking in Unity, and then we'll be right back.
My time with BTS has been a time of theological excellence, but it's also been a time of learning practical personal ministry.
The things that I learned here at BTS, I have implemented them into my ministry.
I was not necessarily planning on getting a seminary degree. I just would choose Birmingham Theological Seminary classes that I was the most interested in, that I thought could help me develop the most. But I ended up getting my MDiv from BTS, and there's so much that I've learned.
I'm really, really indebted to BTS because without it, I don't think I could have gotten this far. I initially started it because I had been called to a church, had no theological education, but knew I needed it. So between having my first child, doing my first job, and having my first church, BTS came in and just sort of helped me to understand what it meant to be a qualified minister and to be a studied minister that could rightfully divide the word of truth.
My name is Monique Duson. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. Life was tough, but more than that, life was Black. Lessons that the streets taught me were secondary to what my mother instilled in me, being Black. I was a Black child, and one day I would grow up to be a strong Black woman.
My name is Krista Bontrager. I was raised by a Christian mother in the suburbs of Los Angeles. My mother instilled in me a love for Jesus and a strong work ethic. She taught me that if I worked very, very hard, someday I would grow up, go to college, get a good job, and have a family. In 2018, Monique came to live with my family. I asked Monique a lot of questions about race and justice. Things like, what is systemic racism? Should every church be multi-ethnic? And am I racist because I'm white?
I welcomed Krista's questions, but persuading her to what I knew was true about America wasn't easy.
We had many difficult conversations. And even though she didn't say it directly, I knew Monique thought my family and I were racists. I felt sad and confused.
I was not confused. I saw Krista and her family the way I saw most white people, privileged and participating in racist systems of whiteness. One thing quickly became clear. We saw the world very differently. And either we were both going to change, or we were not going to be friends.
Our worldviews were on a collision course.
Join us as we share our journey searching the scriptures and gaining a biblical perspective on issues like the multi-ethnic church, systemic racism, and how our nation became so divided.
And how we discovered a truth that is deeper than our cultural and ethnic differences, that Jesus makes cultural enemies into family.
Walking in Unity is coming October 15th from Harvest House.
All right, go check it out at walkinginunity.com, and you can see some of our endorsements, read a little bit more of a description, and also collect some cool bonuses. You can get the first chapter, I think, and the introduction, and really read, get a good little teaser for the book. So go check it out, walkinginunity.com. All right, so before the break, Megan, you were really telling us about, in particular, the chapters on climate change and immigration. Now, this week, the chapter on climate change has been a source of, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, the mob coming for you on X. Yeah, it has been a lot in the last couple of days. Lots of drama. So I guess putting it out there was a video with Gavin Ortland. He felt like you had misrepresented what he said, and he took some issue with how you had quoted him a couple of times. I don't know, is there anything you want to clarify or weigh in on at this point in that conversation?
Well, maybe just what you began this interview with, which was just read the book, see what I actually say there. Because, of course, when you have a book and it has a title that is Shepherds for Sale, not every single person that you mention in it are you saying is a compromised and corrupted person. Some of what I do in this book is show, okay, so in the climate change chapter, here is the left-wing money coming in. Here's the kinds of institutions that it's going into. And now here is the results of that institutional money and the impact that it's having. So one of the things I do is show how some of these activists then are coming into seminaries and they're holding conferences under the rubric of creation care. And its purpose is to convince Christians that they need to be activists on this subject. And so then part of what I was doing is showing, okay, here's how it's happened through the last 15 years. And then you show how the very impact that they hope to have, which was a kind of trickle-down influence, then created the exact conversations among Christian leaders that they intended for them to have. And so Gavin had made a video a couple of years ago about climate change. And his argument was Here is why I think Christians need to be taking up this issue. And I used his video, and I specifically said, this is not to single him out. It's just an illustration of the kind of thing that's happening out there. So I used his video as an illustration, and I kind of broke down what I thought it was missing. Here's why I think from a scientific level, it is not presenting a full picture. And here is why I think from an argument of loving your neighbor, I don't think it takes into consideration all of the different ways we might love our neighbor when it comes to an issue like climate change. For example, we know that something called eco-anxiety has become a very serious problem among young people, particularly Gen Z, because they really believe that the earth is going to be destroyed, and it is giving them a lot of mental health issues and a lot of anxiety. A lot of them say they feel anxiety about it every single day. And my argument was that I think Christians would do better to reassure an anxious world with news of a loving God and a stable creation. So it was really just a little bit of debate over views on climate change, and saying, here is how I think so much of this conversation that was deliberately brought into the church is now manifesting itself. So, and he took some offense at that. And, I disagree with his video, some things that were not about him that I, in fact, said in the very final paragraph of the entire chapter that call back to someone else, not to him at all. And I think it's very clear that it's not about him. He was saying, well, she said that I'm making this a biblical litmus test. And I wasn't talking about him. I was talking about someone who actually said, Dr. Jonathan Moo. I'll tell you who I was talking about. Dr. Jonathan Moo, involved with Arosha, one of these left-wing funded groups, climate change groups, who came into Southeastern Seminary and said that being faithful to the gospel requires Christians to engage creation care, and then defined creation care as taking up climate change activism. In fact, he suggested to the seminary students that they buy carbon credits from his organization. So that was the kind of thing I was talking about. So whether inadvertently or not, I don't know, but that wasn't about Gavin Ortland.
I think, though, that what you're raising in the chapter is an important point, that what you're trying to say is that sometimes some terms have an ideology behind them, and our audience will understand this. So we know, and we have talked for 4 years about how certain words like equity or diversity have an ideology behind them. They sound nice. They sound like things that Christians ought to get behind. But when we just sweep it under the banner of love for neighbor, that's not going to be a robust enough argument biblically to really put forward, a cover story for what really are progressive ideas. And diversity is just a pretty word for critical consciousness, that there. And so I think the big point you're trying to make in the chapter is there are some times when people use the term creation care as a front to try to backdoor progressive ideas. Now, you're not suggesting, and you make this clear in the book, that you're not suggesting every person mentioned in the book creates or participates in every error. I think that what's important is that sometimes we might create a setup where we're saying, well, unless you participate this way, like in 2020, unless you're going to participate with racism in a particular kind of a way, then you're not adequately anti-racist. You're not doing it the right way. I think your point is, look, there might be other ways of tackling the climate conversation. Look at the work that Cal Beisner is doing. He's also having a conversation about climate issues. He just thinks the solutions are different. So just because I don't go along with something, and I'm not saying this is what Gavin Ortland believes, but just in general, just because I don't go with the World Economic Forum's vision or the solutions to climate issues, doesn't mean I'm for dirty water. It doesn't mean that. We can get to this a different way. I don't know. Am I on the right track there?
No, that's that exactly. And it's a debate that we're having that we should have between what is creation care and how that terminology is being used. And it is so often used to get the church to align with progressive priorities. And I always want to bring it back to the specific legislation, because that is the ultimate goal of the people who are funding these things. And how does that bump up against a different point of view, which is creation stewardship, which is something different. And I am by no means an expert on these things. What I really wanted to drill down on a lot of these issues, now, some of the issues are extremely biblically clear cut, but on the issues that aren't, where the problem comes in is when they are being brought in legalistically and through spiritual manipulation. And this was one of those instances of this subject. I mean, is if you are bringing in the subject of climate change by saying you have to take this issue up to be faithful to the gospel, well, now you have a legalism issue, because you are adding something to grace, to the gospel, to say this is what we as Christians are required to do to be obedient to Christ, when I don't think you can in any way back that up. So
which
that's
again,
really
you're not saying that's what Gavin is saying.
No. Wasn't what I was saying. He was saying.
Yeah.
I was saying this is what has been brought in
Yeah.
through all of these large foundations, disseminating information through seminaries, through churches, and it has an impact. And it was just kind of, look, here is an example of what in fact, here, let me explain. They specifically say in one of these reports, one of these left-wing foundations, they say what we hope to see now, since the trickle-down, big, influential evangelical star model did not work for us, what we want to see now are more people in the seminaries who are better able to reach out to the young students on a grassroots level. And somebody like Gavin Ortland, as a Keller Center fellow, who has a very large audience on YouTube, particularly among young theologically minded people, or even seminary students, it was exactly the kind of thing they hope to see. So it was a good illustration of this is what they hope to see, and it's what they're starting to see.
But you're not suggesting that Gavin's taken any money. You're not.
No,
Suggesting.
I don't make any suggestion like that in the chapter.
Yeah. I'm acquainted with Gavin through my previous employer. He is absolutely, the way he presents himself on YouTube, he's a very nice guy. He's a very intelligent scholar. I've greatly appreciated many of his videos on his channel. I appreciate his defending the faith. This is and I rewatched the video today, the original video on climate issues with him. And, you know, there's some things I agree with him about, and there's some things like, oh, I would love to have coffee with him and ask him some clarifying questions about some of these things. But I think that big picture, what you're trying to go for here is, hey, this is an issue that Christians need to have more public conversation about, but there's different ways of tackling this. It doesn't have to be just one way.
Yes. And at the same time, I do think we can openly talk, though, about it does have some theological implications, and we can bring those in. But as you put it, there should be a robustness there. Because if we're going to suggest that humanity can do something to radically change our weather patterns and climate, then I do think there are biblical implications there. But what I would like to see is more of a theological appeal to, okay, what would that mean for us if we look at the Genesis 1 mandate? What does that look like in caring for the earth? And what does it look like to take dominion, not just to be gardeners? Because you'll hear that term a lot too. And not simply, and this was one of the things I critiqued in Gavin's video, an appeal to scientific consensus. Because if we have learned nothing over the last few years, it's that there are often a lot of political maneuvers and leverage being placed in various places in order to reach consensus. And we don't always know what they are. So I don't think as Christians, an appeal to secular scientific consensus is enough.
Great point.
That's a whole word and a great point. Yes. And, you know, I think in that chapter specifically, and I'll move on from that in just a minute, but I appreciated the fact that you did thread through, like, what are gospel issues? Well, in order to even understand that, we need to know what the gospel is. And then you gave a great presentation of the gospel. And I was like, okay, yes, go ahead. Talking about words being redefined, this is clear with the pro-life movement, and you write about the pro-life movement. And I think the pro-life movement is like chapter 3. How do you see the pro-life movement, or do you see the pro-life movement redefining terms? And if so, like, what are those terms and how is it being redefined?
Well, and it is funny that is something that comes up a lot, is this redefinition of terminology. And I know it's something that you guys do a lot of work on, because sometimes a word or just a key term that we all agreed on 5 minutes ago takes on new meaning. And you have seen that with pro-life, whereas it used to be very clear for 30 years that what it meant was protecting the life of the unborn in the womb. That's what it meant to be pro-life, that we stand against anything that would allow you to deliberately murder a child in the womb. We're against that. Well, now things are being added to it that dilute the significance of that term. And it is adding things like, well, if you are not pursuing racial justice, then you are not truly pro-life. If you are not pro-gun control, then you are not pro-life. If you are not backing certain immigration policies, then you are not pro-life. And all of those things are, to me, biblically debatable in a way that the pro-life question is not. And so one, it's stealing the moral significance of the pro-life movement from it in that term. And it's also weakening the importance of it, because all of those other things do not have that first order importance of thou shalt not kill that the pro-life movement does. So that is why I have such a problem with those who are starting to say, well, you have to do these other things too to be pro-life. Well, no, you don't.
No, I agree with that. I think when we are talking about the pro-life issue specifically, you said that so well, like everything needs to come in. Like I just read a book where you can't really talk about the pro-life issue unless you're talking about giving like 4D sonograms, or those, I haven't had a baby, so those X-ray machines.
Yeah.
Where you get to see the video of the baby. Or you can't, like Lecrae said a couple of years ago, like how can we talk about abortion? We can't talk about abortion without talking about like Black poverty, or whatever his spin was. But all of these things get collapsed onto this pro-life conversation. And it's like, no, we need to actually keep the main thing. Now, can all of these other things be conversation? Sure. But to say that I can't talk about this without talking about that isn't true.
Well, and you just brought up a good point in that so much of it has also been attached to expanding a welfare state that I don't think is necessarily the answer to a desire for abortion. So that's part of this debate. Well, why do some women seek abortion? Is it only because they're impoverished and afraid? And yeah, of course, there's a lot of cases like that. But there's also a lot of cases where you have women who got pregnant and simply don't want to have a baby. And all of the welfare entitlements in the world are not going to change that. And we can look back through history of just the last few decades and see that expanding welfare entitlements has not slowed abortion in some communities. Yes. And so I think that's part of the conversation we need to have. And it's why you don't say to be pro-life, we also have to back broader social safety nets. Now you can argue for backing social safety nets, but you don't have to do that to be pro-life, or you don't have to argue for vaccinations, COVID vaccinations to be pro-life. No, you don't.
There's so much there. There's a whole show even within that. And especially as I do another podcast that looks just at Black issues, and how that conversation gets so hijacked when we're talking about the pro-life movement, and how in reality you do it. The argument is to expand welfare in order to be able to be pro-life, or to expand education, or we need to make sure that we're tackling all these other things. But in reality, what you're saying is that abortion should be okay. We should all be okay with abortion if you're not going to be, talking about all of these other things too. And this is simply not true. Krista, go ahead.
I want to just say once more and encourage people to read the book. I just can't emphasize that enough, because you're going to read a lot of innuendo out there. And to some degree, Megan has come in and stirred the pot a little bit. And she's trying to, again, I look at her book as being an effort of taking a lot of different tweets and blogs and books and videos and try to collate it into a narrative where she's trying to make a case that some of our faithful, historically faithful and important Christian institutions have been penetrated by progressive people or ideas or money that has caused a shift. And you can weigh out for yourself. Her book is replete with footnotes, and many of them you can go look up yourself. I've been working my way through it. But here was my litmus test, is that there are 3 subjects in your book that Monique and I both have researched over the last 4 years in detail and with rigor. The LGBT chapter and a lot of the ground that you cover there, the chapter on race and critical race theory, and the chapter on the pro-life movement. And so I went into the book. I said, okay, I'm going to read these 3 chapters first, and I'm going to see, how does she fare? Does it look like she's being accurate with the reporting? Because these are things that I have researched independently and that Monique and I know a lot about. And I can tell you that in those 3 chapters, on those things that I have researched, her representation of what's happening, what's happened, the money trail, the concerns, the quotes, all of that is very well done. And as I've been chasing things down, she's got a few receipts I didn't even know about. Like I told Monique this morning, we got to do some more podcasts. I got some new things to highlight here. But I just want to commend you, Megan, in your research and in your efforts. You're not claiming to be error-free. This book is not the Bible. And so you are out there making your case for what you see as a concern. And I want to encourage people to weigh it fairly and impartially and not just go by reviews. I know, Monique, you have a comment.
No, I just wanted to piggyback off of that. And, some of what I've been seeing on Twitter is really sad. And, like calls to, review the book poorly or to interview bomb, like in the comments and things like that on live interviews. Or I even saw a conversation that somebody else posted of a screenshot about take a video down. And do we really participate like that? Like, I'm petty, okay? Like, I can own mine. But even in that, like, no, we allow people to make up their own minds. And we read and then we critique. And if you have a critique, then critique. Make it a big row. And she's still going to stand 10 toes down. Like, it's okay. But what it gives when you automatically just want to not even allow people to have their own thoughts or comments about certain things, it kind of gives this vibe of, well, just throw that over there. We don't want to know, or it can't be true, or we don't touch this over here. No, let things be touched. Let things be wrestled with a little bit. And I just think that we should be okay with that. We should be okay with turning on the lights and inspecting what's happening within evangelicalism. And if we're not okay with that, or if we get in all of our feelings about that, then it makes me wonder, why can't we turn on the lights? Maybe you have a different opinion than I do, but it does kind of give the lights are turned on and people have issues with the lights being turned on. But just my opinion.
That's how I'm kind of experiencing it, but it's only been a few days. I expected some pushback, but I expected a little more pushback on the actual subject matter of the book. And it has felt like a lot of periphery issues, which is fine. But yes, I would like to have a little more debate. And I'm very open to that about, look, you see these issues differently. Let's talk about that. But I do think it's important to know, if you do see these issues differently, I think you, as someone who might be coming from a more progressive point of view, you should want to know how you might be being influenced too and aren't aware of it. Because I want to know. So I think that's just a good thing all the way around to go, okay, this might be an institution I really trusted and I still like these materials, but it's good for me to know who's backing it.
Yeah, that's so good. And I did a podcast on New Year's Day this year about 5 things I had changed my mind about since 2020. And it was a lot of me just kind of confessing like, hey, I could see I was sort of drifting into some progressive ideas over here. And here's been my journey back. And so I think you're raising a really good point of like, we should all want to kind of inspect where we are and evaluate that, even, just to make sure that we're still being biblically faithful and weighing that out. And, I think that that's an important point. I think, Megan, a question that I get a lot, and I don't know how to answer it, and I would love to hear your answer, is it's really hard to get reliable information these days. Who do you think are a few reporters that we should be following on the regular? Like, who, in your opinion, is doing some good work?
Oh, I am a huge fan of so many of my colleagues who are still at World. They, I know you, I'm sure you tracked some of this reporting that Mary Jackson did on Crew and Revoice, just doing phenomenal work there. So that's, I mean, those are people that I look to very frequently. And I'll tell you what's been interesting to me is some of the secular progressive reporters who I would agree with them on very little, I am sure, but I have come to trust them as reporters because they broke from the pack and went, wait a minute, that this story that you're telling does not line up. And that was somebody like Matt Taibbi from formerly of Rolling Stone, and he's now independent. Somebody who I actually got a chance to interview him a few months ago, and we were laughing after the interview because I went, if someone had told me the original Rush Limbaugh baby that I would be singing the praises of that, I mean, this was a joke, that commie pinko Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone, but so much of what I saw from him, even though we come from such different perspectives, was that he was willing to break ranks and take costs from his own industry in order to tell the truth. And that taught me to trust him. So he was somebody that when he started doing that reporting, I knew I could trust him, even if we disagreed on a lot. Same thing with independent journalist Schellenberger. What is his first name?
Is it Michael Schellenberger?
Michael Schellenberger.
Yeah, I follow him on Twitter.
Schellenberger is another. Yeah. And the free press generally. When you saw Barry Weiss leave the New York Times and launch the free press, they have done a tremendous job of covering stories like the euthanasia movement that you will not see other secular media outlets touch. And they're doing a phenomenal job on that. And also, I got to quickly shout out the Christian Post, too. You might mention that your daughter's done some work for them. I think they've done some tremendous work, particularly on this transgender issue with Brandon Showalter's reporting. He has been dogged, and he cares so deeply about the young people whose lives have been ripped apart by what I think is just a demonic ideology. And he cares passionately, and he pursues those stories with truth and with virtue. And he's just unafraid and crosses a lot of people. And so he's another one that I really admire.
That's super helpful. And Barry Weiss, just so people know, she's a lesbian, she's a Jew, but my daughter really thinks the same. She's like, she does some good reporting and breaks some good stories. So, just let people know, like, these aren't all Christian people. We might have deep differences with them from a worldview standpoint, but at least they're trying to be in reality and reporting reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not hired. They're not reporters for hire.
That's good. That's a good way of seeing it.
Yeah, that is. As there are young people, I'm glad you brought up, reporters for hire, very young people who I think are going to wrestle with, being that person who might be on the outside, who might not go up the ranks as quickly. But then, the other option for them is to be the reporter for hire. What encouragement would you give to students who are looking to pursue journalism, who actually want to be the right kind of journalist? What encouragement, and why would you encourage them to still pursue a career in journalism?
Well, one, Ephesians 5:11, we don't cover up deeds of darkness, we expose them. So we have that mandate, and that's not going to be every Christian's task, but some of us will have that task. And if you feel like maybe you have the gifting and Providence has kind of led you into a place where you could do that, I would encourage it. And I always kind of give it a shout out to reporting for moms, because it's such a great flexible job if you have kids. Because whether you're a freelancer or on staff, it's something you can do from anywhere. And, another part of why we need these journalists is because we understand human nature and we understand that we're fallen. And if there's not accountability, any institution tends to fester and rot tends to come in. And that's not to bash the institution in particular. It's just life in a fallen world. And that is why you need sort of the watchman on the wall, so to speak. So that's why I always encourage people to go into it. And then, a big part of what I would tell them is, and I know it's cliched, but it really has worked out for me, is that I just went after the stories that I couldn't not go after. I care so much about the church. I was so bothered by what I was seeing going on that I didn't know how to be quiet about it as I was coming across this information, as I was seeing these things happen. I couldn't not write about it. And so at no point did I have a plan like, I'm going to write this report about how these evangelical ministries and leaders handled COVID and how they platformed the former NIH director, Francis Collins, and how he lied. And it wasn't like I went, this is going to go viral. When I wrote the story, I really thought nobody would even read it. That was my initial story that really kind of put me on the map on this subject. And I can tell you that I wrote it in the off hours. I didn't even pitch it to Daily Wire first when I was working on it. And I remember kind of, pity partying to my husband going, I don't even know why I'm doing this. Nobody's going to read this. Nobody cares. And that was the story that kind of set me on this path. And then the next thing happened and the next thing happened. And then the book happened because I was just writing about the stories I really, really cared about. So I really do believe that God put some passions in our heart on purpose, and that there's nothing wrong with chasing them. If they're the right passions, let's be clear. I mean, biblical, good, godly passions.
Sure. I was glad that you wrote the story on Francis Collins. I was kind of working on cobbling something together. And when your story came out about him, I'm like, yes, I'm just going to share this because this is everything. I had a lot of the same thoughts and had been kind of trying to put something together. And so I was so glad you did it. And I think that the work that you're doing is just incredibly valuable. Please keep going. And the encouragement that you've given to young people, there are many young people who do listen to this podcast with their parents. And so I think that that's going to be an encouragement because like you said, there's a lot of stories to tell and we need a lot more reporters to do it. So thank you so much, Megan, for hanging out with us today. And
yes, thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks for having me. This might have been the most fun time I've had so far promoting this book. So
well, we are glad you could have a little fun. Wow, that was such a good conversation, like whether people, wherever they land with, liking the book, not liking the book, I still think that you should read the book and, give it its fair chance. Don't just go off of the words and thoughts of critics or the mob or, other people who haven't read the book. So now you're getting your information from somebody else who haven't even read the book. No, read the book for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said at the top, really people who are following this podcast, a lot of this is not going to be new information. Some of it might be, but there's a number of the topics that she covers that we have covered on this show or our other streams. So if you don't mind being in an uncomfortable place of saying, look, I'm convinced that there's evidence that some of our Christian institutions have been compromised and money may have been part of that conversation. And, maybe somebody reads the book and they realize like, oh, I didn't even see how maybe I've adopted some of these ideas, and I've adopted some ways of thinking that are compromised. That's okay. I mean, there's time to turn back and rethink or restudy the Bible, or this isn't a shame or blame conversation. But I think it's important for us to, in this ministry, you and I have taken some controversial positions. We've consistently said some things that people don't appreciate, and when you were taking a position against BLM in 2020, nearly the whole world was going BLM's direction, and you were saying something very different. So I just think it's important for people to, like you said, just study the matter and read the book and make up their own minds.
Yeah, that's my thought on it. All right. So while this has been fun, next week we will be talking with Mrs. Erin Kunkel, the other half of Maven Ministries. She was a teen mom, and she's going to share a bit of her story with us. And then later in the month, you are actually going to sit down with Kevin Briggins, my co-host on Offcode, to look at some issues regarding politics and political party and how to actually read a political platform.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be helpful, and not without taking necessarily promoting a particular party, but helping people think through how to read a political platform in light of their worldview and having some conversation about that. So with that, we hope that you enjoyed the show. We look forward to your feedback. Share it out and check out Megan's books. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and we will see you very soon. God bless.
There's nothing left.